Hello and welcome to Property TV. My name's Stephen Galpin and this is our series Spotlight. Today we're going to be looking at Europe and in particular France. With me today to talk about this subject is Joanna Leggett, Director of Leggett Immobilier and specialist in the French market. Jo, hello.
Hello Stephen, nice to see you today.
Have you had a good trip over?
Yes, it's been a quiet trip, not as many people as usual on the trains, but yeah, very good trip over.
And what's your travelling arrangements now with this quarantine? Are you free?
We're completely free. Yeah, we were sort of in lockdown before, so we've sort of opened up a little bit quicker. There's still no flights though from my area going in and out. There's probably one a week where they'd normally be 3 a day.
Okay.
But I came over on the Eurostar. And the TGV, which is a lovely way to travel. Obviously, no food, coffees or drinks or anything on the trains. But yeah, it's a different way of travelling, but it's safe, so that's good.
And what about prospective purchasers travelling to France at the moment to look at things? Is that possible?
Yes, it is. What we've actually noted is a huge increase in the northern and western parts of France that you can drive to in a day. And we've noticed in the market in general that a lot of people are now perhaps looking at France as opposed to other European countries because they can drive if they're worried about flying or they're worried about coming on the trains even. So the northern parts of France like Pas-de-Calais, Brittany, Normandy, right down to the Vendée and the Charente, we're seeing an awful lot of increase in people coming for those particular areas.
Okay. Now, you know, your agency is one of the largest in France. Just how is the average agency coping over there? Are they maintaining business?
Well, during lockdown, it was expected that maybe 3,000 agencies might go out of business, and that's what they were, you know, sort of in the news and the tabloids, etc. in France were talking about. But actually, it's been quite the opposite. I think because just before we went into lockdown or before COVID happened, the market in France was massively strong. It was probably one of the strongest markets we've had in quite a few years. There were over 1 million sales in France last year alone. And I think what's happened is there's been pent-up demand. People have been wanting to buy or move, or this is the French, the local market, and they haven't been able to. But the time that they've spent at home or in lockdown has made them reflect on what they're looking at, what they're buying, etc. They've had more time to do research, they've had more time. So what we've seen in France as a market as a whole is a huge amount of clients now rushing to buy because they've had 3 months where they haven't been able to go anywhere. So the pent-up demand has seen an increase. We do expect that in the market itself to sort of that will die off maybe September, October time when all of those people that have been waiting have since bought. However, interest rates in France are so low at the moment. You can get a mortgage fixed return for 1.2%. So it's encouraging first-time buyers, which again pushes the market. So at the moment, the market's very, very strong, and where they thought agencies might be going out of business, they're not yet, which is a good thing.
Okay. I mean, you mentioned there that the actual French market itself, with natural residents there is still quite strong. I mean, over here you'll appreciate we had 3 months where there was a moratorium on trading anyway. You couldn't buy anything if you wanted to. So nothing like that's affected the French market. In France, there were still transactions going on. I mean, they just adapted, and I think that will be the way of the future. There was a lot more DocuSign where people could sign, where you'd normally have to be sitting in front of a notaire. It was allowed to be done by proxy, allowed to be done by DocuSign. There was some sort of Zoom type meetings done with notaires and clients. And I think that might be the way forward because, you know, the traditional way of buying in France is you have to sign in front of the notaire if you're getting a mortgage. If there's no mortgage on the property, you can sign by proxy. But we also saw, you know, in the market as a whole, a lot of clients buying without seeing the property, but with new technology, with the virtual tours, with the live viewings. It's no different, is it?
Exactly. People can actually see the whole property. So for those properties in the market that had virtual tours or had you know, the facilities of doing live viewings. You know, you could be in Australia, America and the UK, and all three of you could look at the live viewing at the same time, ask the questions with the agent. So it was as if you were having a viewing. And that may be the future. future for estate agents, you know, for people that are selling internationally.
Yeah, interestingly enough, in the UK we've come out of this ban on trading property, and the agents are busier than they thought they were going to be. I think you mentioned the word sort of a pent-up demand. I think that's very much happening here. But we're also getting feedback that there's quite a lot of people moving out of the sort of centres like London and Manchester and Birmingham out to the countryside because they're fairly convinced that working from home is going to be the future. Now, I've got to say, I'm not quite as convinced as they, and I don't think I'd be moving home on the basis of it. But have you had a similar experience in France?
Yes, we certainly have. The French tend to buy second homes in their own country a lot, maybe perhaps in Portugal is a second favourite for the French, and America. But we've seen a huge increase in the market where Parisians in particular, 42% increase, looking at buying secondary homes, not necessarily moving to the countryside. The Parisians that actually live in Paris are looking for more space, so outside space, whether that be a balcony or it be a terrace or it be some form of a garden, but they're still staying in Paris. You know, as you say, you're not necessarily going to move out into the countryside. But we are seeing a lot of city owners, you know, who live in cities looking for a secondary property that if this does happen again or there's a huge pandemic, that they have somewhere to go and where there is space. Also, we are of course seeing, we're getting a lot more requests than so are all the agencies in France for properties where they have office space or where there's a building that they can convert into an office. Some companies have already suggested that actually we found that we can work from home, which does reduce our, you know, office space and our rental of the office space, etc. And they are looking for properties with offices at home as well. Whether that takes off long term, I don't know. It really depends on how this sort of pandemic pans out as such.
Yes, I often wonder where we live in an environment here where it's all leasehold and you've got your freeholders' terms in the lease, and of course a lot of these leases say no business from home.
Right, yes, of course.
I don't know that I'd like to be the district judge or whoever adjudicating on
whether
the government's directives override the lease or whatever. I don't
well, that's
know.
where we were told to stay at home. You know, you can't argue with the government as such, I presume.
Well, I think so. Okay. Well, I mean, that's very good to hear that the market's strong in France. In terms of percentage up and down, what about UK visitors to France then looking at properties at the moment?
Well, there's a window at the moment for British people that want to move and have permanent residency in France. They really have a window now between now and October if they want to get in and be able to have the same rights as any British person living in France before Brexit. Right. So the Brexit deadline is the 31st of December, as we know. We're not sure what deal is going to happen after that, but what we do know that if you are in and you are resident before then, you'll be entitled to the same agreements that we have now. So, for example, for myself, I just have to apply for a carte séjour, which is a work permit, and that's it, and just prove that I have enough money to live off. After the 31st, if I wasn't already living in France, then it would be like an American or a South African, for example. You'd have to go through the visa process, and there will be a lot more paperwork. So in general, agencies have seen quite a big demand from British people. Again, it really depends on the transport links, though, for being able to get there. At the moment, there are a lot of Brits in France because all sales will take generally between 3 to 4 months to complete. So October really is the cut-off point. If you haven't put in an offer and the sale hasn't commenced by October, it's not going to complete by December.
What's the trigger point? Is it the exchange of contracts or the French equivalent, or?
No, it's the sales process is quite simple in France. So you could come over this weekend, for example, put an offer in on a property. The paperwork could be drawn up in 3 or 4 days. Exchange of contracts. Then you have a 10-day cooling off period whereby if you decided actually we've rushed into this, we don't really want to buy the property, you can pull out. After the 10 days you would need to send your deposit to the notary's account, and then obviously all the searches and everything that a notaire would normally do happens, and within 3 months you can complete. For the vendor, once they've signed the compromis de vente, the exchange of contracts, they don't have the 10-day pulling out clause. They're completely contractually signed into that contract until completion.
Okay, and you can run your residency application in tandem with that?
Oh yes, of course. I mean, for basically, we've been given until June 2021 to be able to get your residency application in, but you need to go to register with your local prefecture, which is like your town hall or your local mayor's office, to say I'm here and I've moved here, so that they are aware, even though the application might take till next June to go through. Okay. And at this stage, we still don't know what you're going to need.
All right.
You know, if it goes back to pre-Maastricht, it's literally proving your income, which in those days you needed 10,000 a year. We're thinking it might be perhaps 15,000 for a couple now.
All right, Jo, thank you for that. We're going to go to a break now. Join us after the break. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Spotlight. My name's Stephen Galpin and with me is Joanna Leggett. Joanna, we were talking in the first half about the effects on the general market in France. What I want to talk a little bit now is have you noticed any significant change in the requirements of particularly UK people going to France to look for property? Are they looking for a different thing now than they were 6 months ago?
I wouldn't say they're actually looking for anything particularly different. I think what possibly has changed is the areas that they're looking at, and that's generally down to the transport links and how they can possibly get to France. As we said earlier, they are looking at driving holidays a lot more, because particularly the elderly or people who are looking to retire to France, they are a little bit scared about flying, so they're thinking, well, maybe, let's just get somewhere a little bit closer if we do need to go backwards and forwards to the UK, particularly people who've got grandchildren who do tend to go backwards and forwards to the UK quite a bit. So, depending on how long this pandemic goes on for, or whether there's a vaccine found, etc. But people are worried about, the travelling and how we're going to get there. So we have seen an increase in the northern western parts of France. Again, outside space, everybody wants outside space, but Brits always wanted that. They've always they want to come and live the dream in France, and that includes the outside space, the vegetable patch, the chickens, etc. People move to France for the lifestyle.
We don't get much of that in London.
No. Well, you probably get chickens, but
they're not appreciative of chickens on the balcony, are they?
No. But I think, Brits have always had a love of France, and the love of France is the lifestyle. They don't come there for investments unless you're buying in cities like Paris, etc. So they generally buy in countryside locations or ski resorts for holidays, etc. And really that isn't going to change. That will still be the same. Okay.
It's interesting, isn't it? The pandemic, one thing it has done is make us appreciative of open space and fresh air. I mean, I look out of my window in the morning and I can now quite clearly see Big Ben and the London Eye and that sort of thing, which is probably, 4 or 5 miles away from here. There doesn't seem to be that haze that usually spoils the London view.
Yeah.
So I think we are learning to want that. That's interesting that it hasn't changed though in any great way. Just the areas.
Yeah, I think the areas for transport links, but British people in general have always gone for the same sort of thing, the rural countryside, edge of a village, edge of a town. It's to live the life, really. It's living the dream, isn't it? When you're eating the wine and the cheese and drinking the wine and the cheese. I
think, and you're going to tell me it's hot there as well now, aren't you?
Well, actually, this Friday's 38 degrees where I live, so it's a little bit hot, But I prefer it when it's around the 30s.
Yeah, well, you'll be happy this weekend. I think we've got 30 in London this
weekend.
Yes,
you have,
right.
We have, yes.
Okay. Joanna, let's just move on to the effects of Brexit. I know on various programmes on Property TV that you've supported us with, we've talked about Brexit before, and we've talked about some of the apprehensions that go with it. But we are actually out of Brexit now. We are ready to do this deal, hopefully, that Boris said is an oven-ready deal, but nobody can quite find the oven yet, I don't think. But what are you finding is the sort of change of attitude towards Brexit now?
I think people are still a little bit nervous. Those that want to live in France, the permanent residents, they are really very keen, and we've noticed that all over the country where they are coming, and they are going to make sure that they're in before December. Nobody really knows, like for situations like healthcare, is it going to still be reciprocal between the UK and France? But there are lots of things that are outside of Europe between France and the UK, like the double taxation, things like that, which were agreements that aren't involving Europe, but they do involve England and France. So I'm sure things like that will carry on with a neighbouring country. So I'm sure that there will be deals set up. There are certain people that will wait until after December to see what the deal is and to see what the situation is. For holiday homes, it probably won't make any difference whatsoever, other than you may only be allowed to stay for a certain period of time, perhaps 3 months, whereas at the moment you could stay up to under 183 days and it not be your permanent residence. So some people will be looking on the side of caution and waiting to see what that deal is before purchasing a property, I would imagine.
Well, I'm going back hundreds of years now to when I was a youth, and I can remember when we went into Europe. Of course, Mr. Heath promised us free travel throughout Europe without passports and everything else. It never really happened anyway, did it?
Well, I think for Europeans perhaps, but well, we are Europeans at the moment, but the British always kept the sterling, and they kept the passport system, which is always a good thing. So that's not going to change.
I presume that's why we're outside of Schengen, really.
Yes, yeah, of course, yeah.
So I mean, effectively, all we're going to do is effectively join a sort of Schengen society, aren't we, where there is some restriction. I
think it's going to be very hard to police because, I drive around the country quite a lot and in and out of France. France borders 8 other countries. So there's the border control is still open for those other 8 bordering countries because they're all still in Europe. So how will they stop a Brit going across? Or do you have to how are they going to look for the papers? It's going to be quite tricky unless you just put, for example, say I went across to Spain. Do I need to have a visa to get into Spain from France? So we really don't know at this stage what's going to happen there, or how they're going to actually be able to police that.
Actually, I'm just visualising a nightmare there where you want to cross. Unless they all agree the same thing, we're going to have real trouble, aren't we?
Yeah. I think with us being British, I'm sure that there will be agreements in place that will still enable us to have the freedom of travel as such. And look how many Europeans are living in Britain. Yes. Our National Health Service is made up of huge amounts of Europeans, Spanish, French, Italians, etc. So, there is going to have to be some form of reciprocal agreement, I'm sure.
Okay. Now, getting on to everybody's favourite subject, which is money, how do you think this is going to affect the prices of property in France?
Well, we did initially think, or estate agents as a whole thought, that perhaps the countryside properties might start going up in price. However, if you look back over the last 7 years, the last 14 years, there's always sort of dips, but never as much as there is in the UK. France has always been quite stable. I think the last high was just before the crash in sort of 2007, 2008, and then the property prices all dropped. Just before COVID, we saw increases, some up to 9% in some cities. That will now level out. I don't think they'll be going anywhere at the moment, particularly in cities. The countryside properties were going up very, very slightly, perhaps about 3% in some sort of provincial towns outside of the cities. However, I think the only difference is going to be there's more people looking at the same property, whereas in France, normally a rural property could take 6 months to a year to sell. We're noticing now that more people are looking at the same property, and there's maybe 2 or 3 people, and they're selling a lot quicker, the rural locations, than they did before. And I think that's the only difference. I think at the moment the prices will remain stable.
Okay, and whilst you say that most people from the UK buy in France for the lifestyle rather than investment, what about the French investment market, perhaps in places like Paris, where you can, as in London, buy off plan, you can buy a nice apartment and that sort of thing?
Well, that still continues. That hasn't really changed. People are obviously worried about work. Is my job still going to be there after the lockdown periods are finished or the furlough periods are finished? Not really sure on that, not really sure how that will change, but to be honest, there's Paris is a worldwide international marketplace, and people do come from all over the world to buy there, particularly for investment. So I think the cities will still survive, you know, this pandemic.
Now, one of the considerations for buying abroad, of course, is safety and security of your purchase. And I think we've all read over the last 20 or 30 years horror stories in Spain of people buying homes that are demolished very shortly afterwards, or have huge amounts of debts attached to them which go with the house rather than the person, and that sort of thing. Now, I would always say people buy in London because of our real estate laws here. They're probably second to none, really. How would you rate the laws and the security in France for people purchasing
France
there?
is probably one of the strictest countries in Europe for property laws. It's probably one of the safest places to buy. The notaire that looks after the transaction, you don't even need to use a solicitor in France, because the notaire has probably looked after that property for centuries, or there may be a family notaire if you're Parisian and have a lot of properties. But it's completely regulated. Even you know, in the UK, for example, you can become an estate agent, you can set up, you don't have to follow any guidelines. I'm not sure if that's changed now. But I know when I first left for France, anybody could become an estate agent if you wanted to. In France, you have to have a license, you have to go through a lot of training. There's 49 hours mandatory training every year now for anybody who's an estate agent in France. And the laws are really strict. The whole company can lose its license on silly mistakes. So it is very, very strict, and and that sort of thing that you hear of in Spain just doesn't happen in France at all.
Okay. Joanna, for our last 30 seconds, would you like to give the benefit of your advice to anybody looking at purchasing in France now?
Well, I'd say do your research, you know, while we've got this time, while people are at home, you know, do your research online, look at the different areas, what the areas have to offer. Climates, temperature can vary. France is the biggest country in Western Europe, so it is huge, and the temperatures, the architecture, the climate, everything will change depending on where you are. And of course budgets, you know, from north to south. The south is obviously more expensive, so have a look at, do as much research as you can before you come over and do a recce trip.
Okay. Joanna Leggett from Leggett Immobilier, thank you so much for joining us on the programme. I'm Stephen Galpin. Join me next time on Spotlight.